There is a place, a National Historic Landmark right here in Pittsburgh, that I always tell people to visit when they're looking for less conventional recommendations. The Cary blast furnaces are kind of hard to describe. They are huge and imposing and rusty, but there's still so much humanity literally riveted into the place. And it's one of the last pieces we have that really shows our city's history as a steel-making giant. And when you go, you are not just going to stand there. You can take their industrial tour and learn all about iron making, the workers who helped build America, and the culture that developed around them. Or you can learn about graffiti and art, taste whiskey, or hear about how these manufacturing centers were impacted by the Great Migration. I really can't recommend these tours enough. Learn more at riversofsteel.com/tours. Jens, there is so much going on in the world right now. And sometimes I just need to be a pure Pisces and let the magic of it all take over for a minute. That's why I am excited to check out Meant to Be. It's this new show at Liberty Magic downtown with the magician and entertainer Hennick. He specializes in offering personalized mysteries. If you haven't been to Liberty Magic yet, get on it. It's this incredible speakeasy theater located on the very same block where Houdini once performed for Pittsburgh near the turn of the century. It's like a perfect setting for a mystery show. Get your tickets at trustarts.org/magic before they disappear. Today on CityCast Pittsburgh, if you own an old home here in a subdivision, there might be some pretty upsetting language in your deed, barring Black people from owning the property. It's called a racial covenant, and even though this stuff isn't enforceable anymore, they are still on the books in at least a few Pittsburgh neighborhoods, especially in our suburbs. We're bringing back a conversation today with a local writer to talk about what got us here and a new law that could help homeowners address it as best they can. It's Wednesday, August 7th. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about. I'm with David Rotenstein, a local historian and writer. David, welcome back to CityCast Pittsburgh.
Thank you for having me, Megan.
So you've got 2 articles out right now about what you call the hidden racist history of some Pittsburgh neighborhoods. So I guess let's start really basic here. What kind of language have you seen that you would call a racial covenant?
So racially restrictive deed covenants were private contracts that emerged around the turn of the 20th century in the 1890s, whereby property owners, and more specifically people creating residential subdivisions, would include language restricting buyers to certain activities. These are the days before zoning was implemented, so many of these covenants included land lot sizes, architectural standards, what type of building you can build, what the setbacks are from streets and sidewalks, uses within the property. So, for example, many of these prohibit buyers from opening a saloon, opening a slaughterhouse, building a tannery, a brewery, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. And racially restrictive covenants were included among these restrictions, and the racially restrictive covenants bind the owners of the properties to not sell or rent to anyone named as one of the restricted class. And very often, actually most of the time, these racially restrictive covenants were targeted towards people of African descent, Black people.
I mean, how explicit were they? How was this told to people that might inquire, say, about a property?
So in the deeds themselves, and in some cases in purchase agreements, the language was very specific. So to give you one example, the deed I have from Sampson Acres in Penn Hills, filed in 1941, reads, "No lot shall be sold to, nor shall any building or buildings thereon be occupied by persons of the Negro race, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy of servants of the Negro race employed by the owner, owners, or lessees of the premises. So that's a very specific identification
Yeah.
of who can't live there.
I know you looked at so many places, neighborhoods in Pittsburgh and a lot of our outlying areas. Was that common to see something like that in our deeds?
That was very common. So in the sample that I looked at for the public source piece, I looked at dozens of platted subdivisions in Allegheny County, and then I pulled a sample of deeds filed for each of those subdivisions, and I went looking for these restrictive covenants. Most of the restrictions that I found in Allegheny County subdivisions had to do with architectural standards, land uses, and that type of thing. But out of that larger sample, I identified 18 subdivisions in Allegheny County, Pittsburgh, and the surrounding areas that had these explicit racially restrictive deed covenants.
I mean, well, let's talk about some of those areas. I'm just looking at the list that's, on publicsource.org. McCandless, West Mifflin, Shaler, Ross, North Oakland, Stanton Heights, Upper St. Clair, Penn Hills, as you say, Sewickley, Mount Lebanon, Hampton, O'Hara, and Wilkinsburg. Of that list, which ones to you maybe stand out, either because of how they came to be or maybe how they changed over time?
The real surprise that I found in doing this research is how limited the exclusionary covenants are for Pittsburgh and for Allegheny County. I've researched racially restrictive deed covenants in the Washington, D.C. area and the suburbs around D.C. and in the Atlanta, Georgia area. And in those communities, you find racially restrictive deed covenants with much more expansive restrictions that go beyond African Americans. They exclude people of Jewish ancestry, people of Eastern European ancestry, some particular religious groups. And what I found intriguing is none of that seems to be present in the Pittsburgh area.
What do you mean?
Well, all of the deed covenants only exclude Black people, which says to me that Pittsburgh was
a very
so
specific kind of racist.
it was. It underscores the history that there is of Pittsburgh as a deeply racist community, deeply racist city where Black people for a century or more have felt unwelcome. As early as the first half of the 20th century, Blacks who had come up to Pittsburgh from the South regularly described the city as the Mississippi of the North.
Huh, David.
It's not an easy history to hear.
It's not. Well, so for City Paper, you focus specifically on Fox Chapel, which was founded in 1934. Tell us about what made them, I guess, an interesting case for you as a historian.
So I wrote about Fox Chapel as what's called a sundown town. You might have heard or read about sundown towns in popular literature. They were places created in the 20th century that intentionally excluded Black people, having signs at the city limits telling Black people to be out by sundown. There were sirens or whistles that were blown at sundown to ensure that people of African descent would leave the community by sundown. Places like Fox Chapel operated in much the same way. They created a zoning code and created architectural review standards and other systems in place that intentionally excluded people of African descent from initially buying homes there. And it was particularly pernicious because it doesn't include this explicit anti-Black racism that you see in the deed covenants. It's more of a genteel way of expressing racism by creating an intentionally exclusive community.
I am still so triggered by that word genteel. It only ever follows something horrible. How would you compare a practice like that to, I guess conversations we've had about redlining, for example, withholding the resources that make it possible for homeownership?
Sure. So what happened in Fox Chapel with exclusionary zoning and the process that they used to keep it all white through history, and the use of racially restrictive deed covenants like the ones we've been discussing, worked hand in hand with redlining to do two things. First of all, they created all white communities where whites could buy homes, create intergenerational wealth, and create these self-enclosed, monochromatic, monocultural communities. At the same time, they also created communities where African Americans of multiple social classes were forced to live. Places like the Hill District that became overcrowded, disinvested urban ghettos. So at the same time as these wealthy white communities were being created, these disinvested urban ghetto areas were also being created. So we have multiple things going on that you can see the vestiges of in the 21st century landscape of Pittsburgh today.
Hey, Yins, one of my favorite parties of the entire year, Arbor Aid, is coming up so soon. It's Tree Pittsburgh's annual fundraiser, and it has got everything. Local cider, live music, a squirrel mascot, and they are known for homemade pierogi and an unparalleled cookie table. Plus, last year, they had these forest-themed boozy giveaways. It was amazing. 10 out of 10, no notes. If you want to hang with us by the Allegheny River in Lawrenceville and support an amazing cause, get your tickets now. It's Saturday, September 14th, and just know everything you give helps increase our tree canopy here and ensures our neighbors have access to trees and all of the amazing benefits that they provide. So come party with me. And pro tip, bring an instrument this year. I'm not kidding. Visit treepittsburgh.org to get your tickets today.
Whoa. Landing an account this big will totally change my landscaping business. It's going to mean hiring more guys and more equipment and new trucks for the new guys to drive the new equipment in. I don't know if I'm ready.
You can do this. And Ford Pro Fin Simple can help. Our experts are ready to make growing pains less painful for your business with flexible financing solutions that meet the needs of your business today when you need them. Get started at fordpro.com/financing.
I know you talked to, several homeowners about kind of the history of their neighborhoods, these subdivisions, usually like they're a developed community within a town, and the language that has, evolved or been added to their deed. I'm curious how they've responded to you and whether they knew that this existed at all.
So one of the truly remarkable things while I was reporting these pieces is I did the reporting during the winter, and most often I'd be walking up to people's doors and knocking on them, total stranger. And every person that I spoke to report these stories was shocked. If I had a camera crew behind me to record you would have seen eyes opening wide, gasps. I mean, the people I spoke to, 100% were shocked. Some were not necessarily surprised because they understood the historical context, but most were genuinely appalled that this language was still in their property titles.
I mean, so what did you say next? You kind of absorb that emotion, and as a reporter, you're collecting their thoughts. What came next?
So what came next is I tried to explain to them that the language in their deeds came about during a particular point in history that was rendered obsolete in 1948 when the U.S. Supreme Court decided what's called the Shelley v. Kramer case. That was a case involving three separate lawsuits filed on behalf of African Americans in Washington, D.C., Detroit, Michigan, and St. Louis, where they challenged the legality of racially restrictive deed covenants. The Supreme Court decided in that case that the deed covenants themselves were unenforceable in the courts. What's interesting is the Supreme Court didn't say that the covenants themselves and the language were unconstitutional. They simply said that enforcing the language was unconstitutional.
So people could continue to add them, but if anybody wanted to challenge it in court at personal cost, I'm sure, then they could do so.
Right, at great personal cost. And actually, you see these deed covenants being attached well after Shelley v. Kramer was decided. One of the latest ones I found was in Washington, D.C., where a black educator tried to buy a home, and he did buy the home, but there was a clause, a covenant in the deed prohibiting its sale to black people.
Mm-hmm. And how recent was that?
That was 1955.
Yeah. Well, and I know from your reporting that Congress completely banned them in 1968 with the passage of the Fair Housing Act. But I'm curious if you have a sense of how many might still be on the books in and around Pittsburgh, because just because they can't be added anymore, we have such old houses. That doesn't mean there's not still remnants of them from the past.
Sure. So in the 1960s, communities began passing open housing laws. And actually in Pittsburgh has one of the earliest open housing laws in the country. It was enacted in 1958. And that was 10 years before Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, prohibiting discrimination in housing on the basis of race, religion, and other factors. So, we're talking about a long period of American history during which time these things could have found their way into property deeds. It's impossible to speculate as to how many might exist in Pittsburgh and the surrounding suburbs. First of all, doing this type of research isn't easy in Allegheny County because there's no master list of subdivisions that were platted in the 20th century. And the other bar to doing this type of research is Allegheny County doesn't have a master map. So you can't go online to a geographic information system and look at platted subdivisions to know what the boundaries are, who platted it, and what year it was done.
I've been in our, city and county archival spaces, and to hear you say there is no master map feels absurd, but I know it to be true.
Stay tuned for an article that I have on the state of county record keeping and archiving. It'll be coming out in a couple of weeks.
And we're looking forward to that. Well, I guess, kind of as you've been doing all of this reporting and just zooming out, how would you say that our communities have been shaped by rules like these? How would you describe, I guess, the long-term effects?
Oh, I think we're still seeing the long-term effects. Just within the past 10 years, reports have been published on how Pittsburgh remains one of the most segregated communities in the United States. Reports have come out documenting how difficult it is for Black families to create intergenerational wealth. Examples of Black women finding themselves at particular disadvantage when it comes to healthcare, education, and housing. Just within the past couple of years, there have been articles in local news outlets about the number of Black professionals who are leaving Pittsburgh because it's a hostile place for African Americans to live. So I think we're still experiencing the consequences of these deeply racist Jim Crow practices.
We'll say, someone listening lives in or around one of these areas. It could be in one of these communities or maybe even in one of these little neighborhoods. If they want to check and see if their deed has this language, where would you advise that they start?
First of all, many title search companies will provide people with a summary of the deeds executed for their property. Sometimes it's a cumbersome process where you have to go to the city county building and research the deeds yourselves to go all the way back to, say, the 19-teens or the 1920s to locate the earliest deeds. And then if you do find some of this language prohibiting sales to African Americans, there now is a solution to that thanks to the Pennsylvania state legislature, which passed last year the opportunity to repudiate unlawful restrictive covenants.
Right. And as you've reported, the state is actually setting up this whole system where homeowners can fill out a form, I guess, and essentially reject this racist language that already exists in their deeds. There's actually a ton of resources about that on the public source page where your story is published.
It's a one-page form. It's a very easy form to fill out that anyone who owns a property with this restrictive language attached to a deed can file free of charge with the recorder of deeds and have a repudiation, a statement put into their deed file that this is unlawful language and it can't be enforced in 2024.
And isn't that just a wild way to address something like this? Like, you can't actually have it fully stricken. And I understand, like, as a historian, maybe you wouldn't want it to be. Maybe you would want the record of what that was once. And so this is a modern homeowner saying, I want nothing to do with this. This is not something that's enforceable, and I don't want it associated with my purchase of this property. But it does seem odd that our best solution is to add in an extra document saying this is not real. You can't really do this. We don't want to associate with what this used to be.
It does sound cumbersome, and it does sound like a counterintuitive approach, but the legislators who crafted this law actually thought about that. And in consultation with attorneys who have dealt with these throughout the United States, so Pennsylvania's legislators believed that it was important to not erase this history, that it be available to people to look back at how we came to be in 2024 or even 2034 or 2054, that erasing this language would be erasing a significant part of our history and thereby making it possible to look back at communities like Pittsburgh or the suburbs and say, look, there are no racially restrictive deed covenants, so we never had the same problems as they did in places like Washington, D.C. or Detroit or other communities.
Yeah. Well, David, as we're wrapping up here, any parting thoughts for folks?
I would encourage folks to read the articles and be curious. Go back and look at the deeds attached to your homes, because most of the people that I talked to didn't know that these covenants had been attached to their properties. And in one case, one of the property owners I interviewed in Baldwin Township, the most recent sale of his property to him, conveying it from his parents' estate, ensured that future owners would have to refer back to the covenant document that was filed. So these things are enforced on people in some cases, and it's incumbent upon property owners to know what they're buying and to know what tools are available, like this repudiation document that they can file to correct the record. Dealing with language like this is very hard. It's hard to read these covenants. It's offensive language. And it's very hard in some cases for people to talk about it.
Well, David, I'm glad you're bringing some of it to light and helping us, like it or not, be aware and hopefully make more positive change in the future. But, you've got to start with knowing your own history to get there. So thank you for helping us do that.
Thank you. I think that's important.
That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. If you're liking the show, please tell someone, rate us, leave us a nice review, and make sure you're subscribed to that Hey Pittsburgh newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Talk to you soon. David, why are we so terrible to ourselves, to each other?
It's a question I ask on a regular basis.